gambling as super apparent in saloons as it was also useful pastime, it was also a risk if you were a cheat, and you might also have to cheat death, because you're not supposed to do that. Some, like the weapon fight at the OK Corral, were the outcome of long simmering feuds and rivalries, but most were the result of confrontation between outlaws and law enforcement. Although in movies, televisions would like to us believe otherwise, it was very rare when pew-pew fights occurred with the two standing fighters off squarely facing one another from a distance in a dusty street. They would just knock your butt out. The romanticized image of the Old West style fight was born in the dime novels of the late 19th century and perpetuated in film era to make such a point that this fiction version of what our mind's eye quickly conjures up when we hear the word weapon fight. You know what I mean. In actuality, the real fights of the Old West were actually so rarely civilized that yes, we might have heard some of these famed robber criminals like sharpshooters like Billy the Kid, Calamity Jane, Jesse James, and Annie Oakley. They wouldn't really wait, you know, unlike Clint Eastwood films. It was probably more rotted than it was organized, and the Wild West saloons were also known for its culture of its violence. Weapon slingers and outlaws, as I mentioned, often frequent these establishments, and disputes were often settled with a handheld weapon fight. Even saloon owners would also provide their own weapons for their patrons, and saloons itself would become a battleground during an open firefight. Saloons would also appear in every town and were your average pit stop on a long journey, and if you're a man who hasn't seen or felt the touch of a woman in a very long time and you can afford it, you might stop by to a certain saloon for a drink and quench whatever thirsty self you might be craving. Like a gentleman's club, most Wild West saloons catered almost exclusively to the white men in the frontier, although women could sometimes find work in the bars as dance hall girls or workers of the evening. But of course you have the madam of the house making sure the security of her girls are okay, but when it comes to money and gold rushes, it was pretty much more valuable than the average person's life. Respectable women didn't frequent Wild West saloons, but women who were less concerned about their reputations might find work there. Many saloon girls were widows and had no other means of support, or young girls who were seeking something more than working on their family farm. They wanted adventure, if you know what I mean. The girls were to dance with the men and get the men to buy them drinks, earning as much as $10 per week, which is pretty a lot for back then. Most saloon girls also made commissions from the drinks they sold, and whiskey sold to the customers were generally marked up to 30 to 60% over its wholesale price. But like all dames who worked in these type of eras, were definitely in her bag, as her status would be noted and gossiped throughout town. One famous saloon girl was also named Fanny Porter. Fanny's family arrived in Texas when she was just 1 year old, immigrating from England. Growing up as both an immigrant and the middle of the Wild West may have inspired her to enter the sporting life, as she took up the trade as a teenager and opened up her own brothel at the age of 20 in San Antonio. In some ways though, these saloons would have been another term for these women of the night to rebrand themselves as cantina girls. However, despite themselves and the services they provide, their life expectancies were actually short. In a typical night, and I'm not just talking about in case, you know, someone does something to them, it was because of the drinking. A woman may have to have consumed up to 30 beers a night. An average lifespan of a woman in the cantina trade was less than a decade. Like as in current times in Japan, they also have these host clubs that if you go and meet these very handsome and beautiful people, you would also be forced to drink with them. And like the cantina girls back in the Wild West, a lot of these people would have suffered a lot of liver issues, which means cantina girls still exist today, just not where we are well known of. And since I mentioned it was so dirty, they'd even bring their horses in the saloon. Like the idea of the Wild West and anyone could do anything they want. That also included bringing your horse inside of the bar to take a selfie with. Like in this photo, where the men of the saloon located in Utah took their horse to be part of the group chat profile pic, and I think my favorite part of this photo is how the bartender is also posing. But despite how gross it was back then, even part of the historical tourist attractions, there are some saloons still open and even in operation today. Saloons like the White Elephant in Fort Worth, Texas, was one of the more than 60 Wild West saloons in the city, and at the end of the 19th century, it is actually still open today for functioning, albeit in a different building. But it still holds a lot of significance as it holds a lot of memento, part of American Western history. Cowboys of the Wild West, after long stretches on horseback, often carried with them a distinctive and pungent horse odor. The scent often became particularly noticeable when close quarters were made, especially in local bars where cowboys gathered for refreshments, and bartenders, those poor guys, were more concerned of the profit than the smell comfort paid by little minds of their patrons stink as long as they had money. The aspect of a cowboy life offers a realistic glimpse into the less romanticized day-to-day realities of the era, where personal hygiene often took a backseat to the demands of frontier living. And so when it came to showering or bathing, the popularity of public baths reflect on the social and economic realities of the time, where communal solutions were often the only viable options for personal hygiene. It also highlights the challenges of maintaining cleanliness in an era before modern plumbing and sanitation. In the Wild West, public baths emerged as a popular solution for the majority who lacked private bathing facilities. So these communal bathhouses, often through a symbol of cleanliness and socialization, often meant sharing close quarters and even the same bath water with other people. Given the rudimentary nature of soaps at the time, these baths could paradoxically expose patrons to more dirt and bacteria from fellow bathers than they had removed. And so, in the Wild West, the lack of antiseptics and unsanitary conditions made even more minor injuries potentially fatal. A simple cut or abrasion could escalate into a serious infection or disease, with settlers especially vulnerable on the trail. This reality emphasizes the constant dangers faced in daily life, where even trivial wounds pose significant health risks. The threat of diseases like cholera from such injuries underlines the harshness of the era and the importance of caution and self-care. It also highlights the limitation of medical knowledge and practices of the time, contributing to the high mortality rates from what we know now easily are treatable conditions. While numbing the pain was a priority, the only solace came in the form of a sweet gulp of whiskey. And the lack of essential dental care resources meant oral hygiene also took a backseat to survival, and a pristine smile was a very rare gem. Toothbrushes were a luxury, and brushing one's teeth was an afterthought for many. And it gets worse, because it always does. When faced with dental issues like cavity or root canals, the remedies were far from sophisticated. Brace yourself, as the favored method was just simply getting barbers and even blacksmiths acting like makeshift dentists and just extracting your offended tooth with pliers. Women in the Wild West were often conspicuous about personal hygienes with their male counterparts, or more than their male counterparts. Despite the challenges of privacy and limited resources, many women made effort to wash regularly, using nearby rivers and streams for basic cleanliness. This practice, alongside the advantage of being indoors, more often allowed them to maintain a higher level of personal hygiene compared to men. This gender difference in hygiene and hygienic practices showcases the early recognition of the importance of cleanliness among women, and it highlights their role in setting standards for personal care, even in a time where bathing and washing were not as so common in a practice. Cowboys and cowgirls of the Wild West era weren't just fashion trendsetters, but their choices of accessories served a dual purposes of practicality and hygiene-wise. Bandanas often provided protections against the gritty winds and scorching suns, and there's also another hidden benefit. In a time when the access to clean water and regular bathing was very limited, personal hygiene practices weren't always up to par, so the bandana, often worn around the neck or face, acted as a makeshift shield. Not only did they safeguard against dust, but they also aided in reducing the spread of germs and unpleasant odors that people so commonly came across the rugged days of the Wild West. And also, if you smelled, at least they can cover it up. In the Wild West, alcohol-fueled bar brawls were common, often escalating to very dangerous levels. The infamous firewater, a potential mix of burnt sugar, alcohol, and chewing tobacco, frequently ignited tempers over trivial matters. While many brawls resulted in minor injuries, some spiraled into deadly conflicts. This volatile environment, where a simple disagreement could lead to lethal outcomes, paint a vivid picture of the lawlessness and rough justice that characterized the era. The prevalence of such violent encounters in saloons highlighted the harsh realities of life in the Wild West, where disputes were often settled with fists or weapons rather than words, underscoring the perilous nature of social interactions during this time. In the 1800s, diseases like cholera, as I mentioned, was a major cause of death in the American frontier. The necessity to prioritize drinking water over uses like laundry and dishwashing exacerbated the risk of disease outbreaks. So cholera in particular claimed thousands of lives, affecting both settlers and indigenous populations. The arrival of European settlers in the Americas had a catastrophic impact on Native American populations, primarily due to the introduction of diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Native Americans had no prior exposure or immunity to these diseases, and they had suffered devastating losses, with some estimates indicating a reduction of up to 90% in their populations. This tragic aspect of colonial expansion underscores the lethal impact of infectious diseases in populations without natural immunity, highlighting one of the most significant and tragic consequences of the European settlement of the Americas. This grim reality of the frontier life underscores the vulnerability of populations to common diseases in the absence of modern sanitation and medical knowledge. It highlights the precariousness of life during this period, where everyday resources and practices could also mean the difference between health and widespread illness. The westward expansion of settlers under the banner of manifest destiny had a significant health implication. As they veneered into new territories, they encountered unfamiliar diseases to which they had little immunity due to poor living conditions. This exposure to new pathogens posed a significant health risk, often overwhelming their already compromised immune systems, and this aspect of frontier expansion highlights the unintended consequences of exploration and settlement on the health of the settlers, revealing the challenges and dangers they faced in unfamiliar environments. Hospitals in the 1800s, prior to the understanding of bacteria, often did much harm than good. The lack of sterilization of medical instruments and close patient patient quarters facilitated the rapid spread of diseases. These medical facilities, intended for healing ironically, became hotspots for infections and diseases transmissions. The conditions in these early hospitals reflected the limited medical knowledge of the time and the challenges of providing healthcare in an era unaware of basic hygiene principles. It illustrates the paradox of places designed for healing inadvertently becoming centers of illnesses, a stark contrast to the sanitized medical environments of today. Despite the advancements of medical science, some rural doctors in the 1800s continued to use leeches for bloodletting based on the outdated belief that diseases were caused by excess blood. This practice, largely abandoned by academic physicians, persisted in smaller towns, highlighting the discrepancies in medical knowledge and practices across different regions. The continued use of leech therapy in some areas served as a reminder of the slow decimation of medical knowledge and the persistence of traditional practices even in the face of emerging scientific understanding. There was a time, of course, a terrifying epidemic known as syphilis swept through a population like wildfire. In a quest for a remedy, medical professions turned into a substance that hold the key: mercury. Despite the severe side effects, patients endured a grueling routine of daily applications of mercury ointment. This reckless treatment could last for years while unleashing many horrors upon the afflicted. However, people who were convinced the treatment was worth it, I guess now we wouldn't practice it the same, but at least we got better in self-care compared to parts of history.
When a story attracted public anger, some settlers in the West were quick to take the law into their own hands. These vigilantes were idolized in popular contemporary accounts, but the justice they served was often brutal and inhumane by most standards. Not content with apprehension and execution, most vigilantes physically tormented any accused. Some folks even took trophies. In 1891, the skin of a sentenced bandit was tanned and made into souvenirs. It's definitely more unique than the usual tacky magnets or door signs, I'll give them that. Vigilantes justified their acts by pointing to the terrible acts that the accused had allegedly committed. Yeah, but to quote my dad, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Even when the accused were caught and were waiting for trial, vigilante squads didn't always have the patience to wait for a legal sentence or risk an acquittal. Instead, they showed up at the jail and demanded to deal with the offenders themselves. In one 1878 incident, an accused killer was caught, taken to jail, with a trial scheduled for the next day. But during that night, 20 or 30 masked men arrived with weapons in hand and took the man away to deliver their own immediate justice. How? Well, they killed this guy by way of the rope necklace of death. Look, that guy probably wasn't long for this world anyways, since most convictions at the time ended in executions. The life expectancy of somebody who broke the law in the Wild West often decreased dramatically after conviction, especially for those accused of taking another person's life. Whether offenders received an official trial or one carried out by the unsanctioned vigilantes, folks demanded justice. In California, offenders were convicted in very quick trials and usually met the end of their life at the county courthouse. Execution usually came shortly after conviction, as appeals and stays of execution were uncommon. If an expected execution did not happen or did not occur quickly enough for the crowd, that's where you've got your vigilantes that I was speaking about a moment ago. I know in one 1851 case, vigilantes convicted a man of stealing gold dust and gave him a simple little 3 hours to get his affairs in order before they ended his life. Like, I don't know about you, but that's not enough time to get my affairs in order. I have too much junk. Law enforcement was still a job during vigilante time, but death in the line of duty was pretty likely. The West had a variety of legitimate lawmen, ranging from town sheriffs and marshals to the U.S. Marshals appointed by the Attorney General. U.S. Marshals were charged with maintaining federal law, and they could deputize local men to form a posse when greater numbers were necessary. And during this period, deaths in the line of duty were kinda common. The U.S. Marshals alone had several deadly incidents. In 1872, a marshal and 7 members of his posse were fatally harmed when they tried to take a prisoner from the custody of another court. In 1885, a deputy marshal and 3 members of his posse engaged in a deadly firing exchange. A prisoner escape claimed the lives of a deputy marshal and 2 posse members in 1887. Another did the same to 2 deputy marshals and 1 posse member in 1893. The West still holds a lot of records for the deadliest incidents involving multiple law enforcement casualties. Not records I want to see broken anytime soon, mind you. Contrary to what you might think after all that, many towns did indeed try to enforce weapon control and restrictions. The Wild West had no shortage of fireable weapons, creating a worrying situation for lawmen trying to prevent violent offenses. Towns like Tombstone, Arizona, and Dodge City, Kansas required visitors to surrender their weapons whenever they entered the town. In fact, the 1881 firing exchange event at the OK Corral started as a conflict over Billy Clanton and the McLaury brothers refusing to give up their weapons when they entered Tombstone. Anyone defying a western town's weapon control laws was likely to meet a violent end. Author and cowboy Andy Adams describes the laws of Dodge City in his account published in 1903. The buffalo hunters and rangemen have protested against the iron rule of Dodge's peace officers, and nearly every protest has cost human life. Don't ever get the impression that you can ride your horses into a saloon or fire out the lights in Dodge. It may go somewhere else, but it don't go there. Most cowboys think it's an infringement on their rights to give up firing in town. And if it is, it stands. For your weapons are no match for Winchesters and buckshot. And Dodge's officers are as game a set of men as ever faced danger. Look, I know weapons control is something law enforcement still struggles to enforce till this day, so interesting to see how that goes. So even with law enforcement being a thing, corruption was kinda rampant. The West had many problems with vigilante justice, but the legitimate lawmen were sometimes not much better. Many law enforcement officers were not consistently paid, earning money only through taking a percentage of fines or collecting bounties on wanted men. In desperate times, some lawmen turned to crime themselves, making corruption a big problem. Sheriff Dave Allison was accused several times of misappropriation of money. Henry Newton Brown was a deputy sheriff tasked with tracking people for a bounty, but on his bounty hunt, he robbed a bank with 3 accomplices. A vigilante mob took matters into their own hands though, enacting fatal punishment. So he did get punished, quote unquote. Timothy Longhair Jim Courtright used his position in law enforcement to run a protection racket that extorted profits from gambling dens and saloons. He died in a duel with somebody else though.
Number 10. Boot Hill Burials. In the Old West, many towns had a boot hill, which was essentially a graveyard where outlaws and bandits and all those bad people alike were all buried with their boots on. Specifically with those on right there. See, these cemeteries were often lacking proper markings, and the dead were buried quickly, sometimes a little too quick without a coffin, reflecting the harsh and lawless nature of frontier life. It wouldn't be abnormal to see a boot sticking up out of the ground on your way home from work, is what I'm saying. Today that would be quite jarring, but back then, completely normal. How yucky is that? I'm like, oh, size 11.5? Perfect. Number 9. Medical practices. In the Old West, broken bones were a common occurrence. Obviously, uneven roads, hopping up and down horses, everything's made of wood that's all broken. Particularly among those who worked in physically demanding professions such as ranchers, miners, and cowboys, everything is going to be broken on your body by the end of the day. Treatment options were limited and often relied on basic first aid techniques, splinting the affected area with whatever materials were available. Wood, cloth, animal bones. It was nuts. It sounds crazy, but back then, it was really the only method for immobilizing broken bones. You have to wrap another bone around it. It's like, ew, please, can I get a cleaner bone? Pain relief was only provided with natural remedies such as opium or willow bark tea, so 50-50 what kind of night you're gonna have there. More serious fractures, such as those that punctured the skin, ow, those required the attention of a doctor or a surgeon. However, back then the doctor had like 2 teeth in one eye, so not much help. Number 8, duels. Yes, duels. Let's talk about these. Duels, gotta say it all deep like. Duels were a common way to resolve disputes. Before YouTube comments, this was the only place to resolve any conflict, alright? In a traditional old Western duel, opponents would face each other, often with weapons, in front of a crowd at a designated location and time. Now, most of the time, these duels would end when somebody bites the bullet. Rarely would a duel end with 2 gentlemen shaking hands, getting over their disagreements. No, never happened. These confrontations, often over matters of honor, were deadly and a normalized part of the culture. Number 7, law enforcement. That being said, back in the day, things were a little different. Not that many body cam back in those days, I'll tell you that for free. With a lack of formal law enforcement, communities often took justice into their own hands. They're like, oh yes, all 17 of us, we've decided, you're out of here. Vigilante coups would form to hunt down suspected criminals, often resulting in brutal forms of punishment without a formal trial. Yeah, no judges needed, no jury duty, nothing like that. The town ended the conflict in 48 seconds. You're welcome, let's get a beer. Let's get a really disgusting beer. Number 6, public punishments. Now, when I say the town handled it, this is what I mean. We gotta go into detail here, because that's why I'm here. Public hangings were often treated as a social event, with crowds gathering to watch as if it were entertainment. How disgusting is that? They were dressed to the nines, they grabbed the whole family. People would come from miles around, sometimes with picnics, to witness this brutal punishment. Yeah, picnic. What food do you pack for a hanging? Nothing with a crunch, that's for sure. You don't want to ruin the show for the people around you. Sorry. Number 5, weather. Weather, you want to believe it or not.
Try again.
Back in the 1800s, obviously weather was a major factor, as it is today. Hailstorms, lightning, high winds. When you're a cowboy, this all sucks even more, honestly. Especially the opposite, when it's dry and humid for weeks at a time. Check this out. Wooden wagon wheels would actually shrink because of the heat. So they had to be soaked overnight just to prevent the iron rims from falling off during your commute during day hours. Yeah, it was so dry the wagon wheels needed water. Yeah, sorry I'm late, my wagon wheels were a little thirsty. Yeah, I had to wait for them to soak up some fun. I can't even drive a car downtown without having a panic attack today, let alone rubbing axle grease on my dry lips, waiting for my wheel to drink water.
Number 4, gangs. If you've played the Red Dead Redemption series, then you've probably held up a train or two. Some of the posses that were famous at the time actually did that though, and weren't so nice about it. The American West was made up of criminal outfits, usually a gang or a posse, involving members who would just live and ride and rob together with. Jobs were scarce, and it seemed that it was just a little easier to just demand what you want and then enjoy the birth of all the media attention after, making some, quote, famous. An obsession, the cowboy culture, the outlaw criminal. Some of them include Billy the Kid's gang, the High Fives gang, and the Oklahombres. That's a good one. Artists were getting better at the time, and people were sketching wanted lists for local sheriffs. These posters would be calling cards for these guys. They kept them, put them in their pockets as souvenirs. Charles E. Bowles, also known as Black Bart, held up a total of 28 stagecoaches without ever being caught, and even had the reputation of being a gentleman about it too, emptying strong boxes but never actually shaking down the passengers. There were even reports that he would even leave verses of poetry behind. Guy's a smooth criminal, huh?
Number 3, the night after. I'm sure the Wild Wild West was wildly lonely. Definitely, this isn't news. Like Kyle said, we've played Red Dead Redemption, just wandering around alone. Sometimes you need more than a train heist, right? Sometimes you need love, even if you have to pay for it with railroad bonds or whatever. Saloons have all the things a lone traveler could want, including STIs. Great, how much is, great, debit. We'll just pay for all this in one swift tap, I guess. The famous Wild Bill Hickok, okay? He had a rough go. Guy had some troubles after a few saloons, okay? He was dipping around in a few bars and yeah. Alexander Fleming wasn't born until 5 years later in 1881, so penicillin wasn't around to save any cowboys at this time.
Number 2, battles. The archetype of the Old West period is generally accepted by historians to have occurred between the end of the American Civil War in 1865 till about 1890. The American frontier, also known as the Wild West, is the geography, history, folklore, and culture associated with the American expansion mainland that settlers started in the 17th century and ended in 1912. This era, giving rise to the expansionist attitude known as manifest destiny, which was the belief that Americans were supposed to travel and expand west. But with that came a lot of conflict. You can't just waltz in and throw up a house when someone else lives there already, you know? Years of warring tribes and bands, colonist battles, ego-filled duels, and the aggressive pillaging of land stolen took countless number of lives. Yeah, countless, like we'll never actually know the accurate number. Roughly 750,000 lives were lost in the Civil War. Yeah, nasty stuff.
And finally, number 1, Helena duels. Beginning, of course, in Helena, Texas, Helena duels were violent, awful. This activity came from what was then the toughest town on earth. And again, this is back in the late 1800s, so what that even means, I can't even compare. The Helena duel began here. There's even a movie called The Duel with Woody Harrelson and Liam Hemsworth. It's not a great movie, but it's a history lesson in itself. A Helena duel puts our opponents' left hands tied together, right? They're just tied together with buckskin or something that smells awful, and you have to just fight each other using one arm. Now, of course, in Western fashion, there was a weapon or two involved that I don't want to get too deep into on YouTube, so it got pretty gory, it got pretty violent. The only rule here was that they can't bleed too much. Awesome, that's a great fun rule, like whipping that one out on Saturdays. Hey, no one bleed too much or else, you know, then we gotta stop. I thought UFC was brutal, let alone a Helena duel, starring Liam Hemsworth, of all people. Really? Starting our list off at number 10, a banker. Today, online banking is easy, right? It's a little bit too invasive at times. I don't know. I get an email from my bank, it's like, Mr. McWaters, do you want to provide for your family? I'm like, chill, relax. Back in the Old West, you didn't get a courtesy check-in email. You didn't have overdraft. In fact, the United States national banking system, well, it didn't even exist until 1863. Before then, you'd have what were called wildcat banks. And, well, these were pretty fun. Here we go. What they would do is wildcat banks, they would take deposits for a short amount of time, collect your life savings, and then unannounced randomly, they would disappear overnight. Just take all your money and then run for the woods. How horrible is that? Imagine going to the bank the next day and it's gone. The bank's just not there. You're standing there with a card. Like, hello? Where did I put this in? You're telling me they pretended to be bankers for months at a time? Fake mustache, oh hello sir, good morning. Stamping things that aren't even real. They did all of that and then they just ran away with all of your money. That's wild. I get it now. I get it. The Wild West. After 1863, a noble profession was to work at a bank, you know, and not screw people over for thousands of dollars. The Hudson Bay Company, Wells Fargo, these are all names that began because of these fake Looney Tune wildcat banks. So next time you see your bank call, be thankful. Don't be stressed, be thankful. They've got your back. They're not gonna run away overnight. Number 9, ranch work. Alrighty, I can't do yard work. I don't know if you can tell by my physical being, but I can't lift a brick. My back doesn't allow me to reach the floor. A weird curve in the back, I don't know. Pulling weeds physically hurts my soul. Or maybe I'm just lazy. One of the two, I don't know. Either way, the Old West would have been the end of Taylor McWaters. To be a cowboy, it meant lots and lots of ranch work. It wasn't all yees and haws and kicking around. A lot of the time you were protecting your cattle. That's stressful, right? All that meat just sitting there in the 1800s, good luck. Cowboys earned between $25 to $40 a month. Yeah, which sounds laughable now, but today that would be around $1,500 a month, which is fine. I mean, for a cowboy, I don't know, it's a bit less than. Do cowboys get sick days? Probably not. They probably just get sick. Number 8, railroad work. This is one of the few jobs from the Old West that I actively see every single day coming to work. Living downtown, they're always adding trains and bridges and not finishing any of them. And ideally, you don't want any toxic substance traveling down those lines, right? Fingers crossed. Well, back in the Old West, railroads were meant to assist the booming mining and ranching industries. Thing is, there weren't enough hands. There was not enough to keep up with the rate that they needed to. Like, who's gonna build a railroad? You know, who was the first person? Railroad workers, monthly, you'd make around $1,000, and this brought a wave of immigrants to the West. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads, they all lay over 1,700 miles. Now, making this actual railroad, it destroyed the bodies of these workers, but without it, American history would not be the same. Couldn't imagine making a railroad. That is exhausting. Number 7, blacksmith. All right, close your eyes and imagine a blacksmith. Just any blacksmith from any time. Is he bald? Does he have a massive beard? Is he incredibly strong and wildly intimidating? Yeah, that checks out. That's what a lot of them look like. Missing teeth, banging something pretty loud, that's a blacksmith. Frontier times were almost a golden time for blacksmiths, believe it or not. Hammers, horseshoes, new railroads, it checks out. No, they didn't need any chainmail, but a saddle wouldn't hurt, that's for sure. We could use a saddle. They would earn up to $200 a day. Blacksmiths were always busy in the Old West. They doubled as auto repair services really at the same time. I mean, I don't know. A guy comes in with a busted up carriage, well, now you're a mechanic. Yeah, go fix this wooden car. Good luck, you have one day. Here's 10 bucks. Number 6, journalism. Believe it or not, the newspaper business cleaned up shop back in the frontier. Everyone wanted to know what the tea was. Tucson, Arizona, for example, back in the day, back in 1831, that one town had 5 different newspapers. Yeah, even though there are only 465 residents, there were 5 different papers. That's stressful. How do you keep up with that much news? I mean, to be fair, before radio and television, yeah, there's probably lots to talk about all day long. That's pretty much all you can do, just talk all day long, so I get it. The industry provided jobs as well. It's very much like YouTube. Here, there's writers, there's hosts, the design and print staff, we have editors. It was a little easier than laying down a railroad, that's for sure. So when it came to jobs, yeah, journalism wasn't that bad. Definitely better than doing anything that has to do with this motion, that's for sure.
Number 5, Romeo and Juliet. What's in a name that which we call a rose? Any other word would smell as sweet? It's often said that art imitates life, but sometimes life can be stranger than fiction, and oftentimes really similar. The Hatfield and McCoys were 2 feuding families in the time of the Old West, whose hatred of one another runs deep. The most serious issues being family members removed, Old West style, by the opposite family, and in one case, a court battle over the ownership of a barnyard pig. But perhaps the best story to come of this feud is the love affair of John C. Hatfield and Rosanna McCoy. The 2 lovers met and instantly fell in love with each other, their families instantly disapproving of their newfound love. Similar to William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the star-crossed lovers story ends in tragedy. After multiple attempts to rekindle their love, including a daring rescue organized by Rosanna to free John C. from her own family, their love never resparked, and John C. went on to marry her cousin. It's said that poor Rosanna died of a broken heart. He loves me not. He loves me, he loves my cousin?
Number 4, bank robberies. If you're going to parody the Wild Wild West, you need a horse. You need a hat, and you need a big sack with a dollar sign on it. Apparently, wasn't it like Bandit Central? Weren't there bank robberies on every dusty corner in every dusty old town? No, there actually was very little, in fact. Bank robberies didn't happen that often back then. In fact, during the Wild West era, officially declared from 1865 to 1900, there were only 8 bank robberies in total. To put that in perspective, in 2017 alone, there were around 4,000 bank robberies in the United States. So it got a lot worse after the Wild West. Now we're on like wild, it's like 17 wilds at this point. The first armed robbery ever in history was done by famous outlaw, you may have heard of them, Jesse James and his brother Frank. This was in 1866. The gang of outlaws robbed the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri. We know all these bandits, but it's like they're just robbers, they're just bad people. We shouldn't really know them or glorify them. But they do this and ride horses, so it's kind of fun.
And the number 3 spot, Good Bad Town. On your way out west, you may come to find that the unsettled lands are full of danger, bandits, crooks, perilous weather, and the occasional tummy ache. When the town of Palisade, Nevada's railroad was expanded and people began to arrive in droves, the town boomed, but so did their boredom. Palisade was rather mild compared to the rest of the expanding West, so much so that when tourists began to complain of Palisade being nothing like the dangerous towns they read about in their dime novels, the people of Palisade acted by staging fake bank robberies, gunfights, and even Native American battles between them and the army, with sometimes the Native Americans participating. Also going as far as using real cattle blood during the staged combat. The citizens of Palisade were such effective actors that a lot of tourists began to run back to the train in fear of what they were seeing. Nothing more American than capitalizing on boredom.
Number 2, Helena duels. Have you guys heard of Helena duels? They're pretty intense, and they're a bit more intense than breakdancing battles, which honestly it's pretty close, but these are like right above it. Helena duels began of course in Helena, Texas, aka the toughest town on earth. At least that's what they called it back in the late 1800s. It still is pretty close. The Helena duel began here. There's even a movie called The Duel with Woody Harrelson and Liam Hemsworth. They showed this style of combat in a pretty brutal cinematic way. Opponents' left hands were tied together with buckskin and each were given a small little blade. It had to be short enough so you couldn't reach any vital organ. That was the trick. It was a brutal detail that made this an unusual event, but just like the Romans and the Colosseum, everybody likes watching violence. Depending what era it is, people are like, yeah, we'll still show up and watch people die, sure. People would make bets during these duels. How did anybody watch these at all? I can't even scroll through Reddit at night without seeing something awful, let alone a Helena duel at like 4 p.m.
And the number 1 spot, I don't like your snoring, partner. There were a handful of dangerous criminals back in the Wild West. This includes John Wesley Hardin. Born to a reverend in 1853, his parents hoped he would grow up to be a preacher. He turned out to be one of the most deadliest outlaws to ever live. Hardin claimed many lives over the years, but most bizarre was when he shot a man for snoring. One night in 1871, while staying at a hotel, Hardin was having trouble sleeping due to the man in the next room snoring loudly. Hardin promptly shouted at the man to stop snoring. Irritated with no response, he fired several shots into the next room, claiming the man's life. After years of being an outlaw and spending a lot of time in jail, he was released for good behavior, where he then received a full pardon. With his full pardon, Hardin was then able to take and pass the bar exam, afterwards setting up a law practice in Gonzales County, Texas. If your lawyer has a longer criminal history than you, there's a good chance you're not going to beat the case.
Kicking off the list at number 10, going the distance. First things first, how much was an IPA back in the 1800s? That's why we clicked this video, right? That's all we want to know. Some beers today cost like $13 at the bar. What's going on? Nowadays we have happy hour, drink specials, wine pairing suggestions that go along with your meal. We have affordable alternatives today at the bar. Back in the 1850s, saloons would price their drinks depending on how far away you had to travel to get there. Isn't that wild? In the Yukon, their shots of whiskey were like 50 cents a pop. That was a lot of money back in the day. If you were to ask for the same drink in a local saloon, say in Colorado, you could get numerous beverages for the same price. And as you would expect, the fancier the establishment, the more you'll spend. But either way, it's not going to be comfortable.
Number 9, manure everywhere. The 1800s were changing times, especially on the western frontier. Cities were being built, America was under reconstruction, and if you see my video on the 1800s technology, then you know how things were about to get a little wild. Except something I want to talk about today is, well, it's gonna drive moms and wives nuts across the country. How many times have you told your husband or the kids to wipe off their feet before coming into the house? Or stop wearing their shoes in the house? Right? It's the worst. I'm sorry, Mom. Okay, but imagine that, except everyone is bringing in their muddy, bloody, and manure-covered boots into the house. Horses and livestock were just a part of everyday life. That means droppings, or road apples as they're so commonly called. The smell alone on a hot summer day could make any cowboy turn green. I think I'm going to puke, Dutch.
Number 8, no stools. Okay, this one's for all the bartenders out there. I see you. I respect you. Bar seating is vital. You get your regulars coming in. Joan with the limp, she's so nice. She's always so nice every day. Always gets a grilled cheese. She's the best. Always a smile on her face. Individuals who want to grab a bite and read the paper, obviously they don't need to take up an entire table for 8, so you have spots at the bar. It's ideal. We're used to this. But back in the Western days, bar stools just weren't a thing. Bar spots it didn't exist. You couldn't sit and vent to your local barkeep about why your ex hasn't texted you back. They didn't have stools at the bar, they just had the rail at the bottom for your foot. Just that little bar rail there for the little lean right there. A nice cowboy lean. Yeah, I'll just eat fish and chips, standing up leaning. Awesome. Just the thing you want after walking in the sun all day long. A foot rail.
Number 7, duels at high noon. Let me paint a picture for you, partner. It's a warm summer night, and you find yourself sitting at a card table in a saloon that's named after a barnyard animal. The piano is blasting a ragtime tune as waiters bustle about, serving drinks to unruly cowboys that fill the establishment. In front of you are 3 unsavory characters, each more than the next. As the night goes on, so do the poker chips. And when one gentleman ain't taking kindly to his losses, some insults about each other's mothers are exchanged. A powerful slap reaches the man across the poker table, matching the energy of Will Smith on an Oscar night. Too soon? I don't know. Wow, West. Wow, West. That's when it's settled. Tomorrow at high noon, they're gonna settle this like gentlemen. A duel at noon with guns. That's how they did it. Does it get any more classic than that? I don't think so, folks. The clock strikes noon, and only one outlaw remains, and he's married to Jada Smith.
Number 6, only talking. Here we go. You ever go to a bar, you're having a nice time, you and your pals order some Caesar salads for the table, the night is now well on its way, we're feeling good. Then 10 o'clock hits and you see a band start to set up. Okay, game time decision. Do we settle up and leave before they start? Or do we give them a chance, end up feeling bad, and feel obligated to stay until the very end at 3 a.m.? It's tough. Usually the latter ends up happening. Back in the 1800s, we didn't have to worry about such an issue. Most of the time, these saloons were just for business. The odd time you would have poker, dice, a piano perhaps would be in the room with some jazzy fingers making an appearance. But when saloons first popped up in Wyoming back in 1822, most of the time it was for lawmen, miners, gamblers, just pure business. Not many blind dates happening in booth 16, you know what I mean? Number 5, the gold rush. Picture a billboard for the Wild West, okay? What's on it right now? A cowboy tipping his hat in the corner with, 4 missing teeth, a sunset in the corner obviously, maybe a horse, and also a bunch of gold stacked up in a mine, right? Well, we've heard about the Wild West here and there, but was there really a massive gold rush? The California gold rush of 1849, despite what history commonly believes, wasn't the first big gold rush, not even close. The first one was back in 1799. A young man named Conrad Reed found this yellow rock right on his property. He had no idea what it was, and for years, he and his father John Reed used this rock as a door stopper. You already know where I'm going with this. This 17-pound nugget of gold, which is worth a lot even today, back then this information was game-changing. Congress then built the Charlotte Mint just so they could handle all this incoming gold found in North Carolina right after. Then later in 1828, more gold was discovered, but this time in Georgia. This was the second rush. Then come 1848, James Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill, California. After the third one though, that's when the thousands moved out west. That one had the biggest pull, so it's pretty big, but not the first. Number 4, the OK Corral. The shootout at the OK Corral went down on October 26, 1881. It's known as the most famous shootout in history. But should it be, really? Going back to Tombstone, Arizona, it's 3 p.m. and we have men of the law and of course outlaws all in the same block. So naturally, trouble ensues. There's not enough land here for all of us, some rootin' tootin' shit. There were about 8 men involved in the rumble, but it barely lasted 30 seconds. Also, it's important to note the gunfight at the OK Corral wasn't even at the OK Corral. It happened near the intersection of 3rd Street and Fremont Street, right behind the corral. Yeah, details matter. 3 lawmen were injured and 3 cowboys lost their lives. Yeehaw. That's a sad yeehaw for you guys. This is why you don't organize shootouts at 3 p.m. I don't know, everyone's drunk, there's bad decisions, apparently there's bad aim. Just slam some milk, shake some hands, go home. Simple. Number 3, Helena duels. So we talked about the bizarre ways folks would settle beef back then. They would slam tarantula juice and shoot animals from the top of locomotives, have a 30-second fist fight in the middle of the day, and then go home. But have you heard of these Helena duels? It began, of course, in Helena, Texas, aka the toughest town on earth, at least it was back in the 1800s. The Helena duel began here. There's even a movie called The Duel with Woody Harrelson and Liam Hemsworth. They show this style of combat in a pretty brutal Hollywood way. Both opponents had their left hands tied together with buckskin, and then each were given a small knife with an even smaller blade. It had to be short enough so it didn't reach any vital organ. That was the Texas trick. Then they're whirled around until they're dizzy, and then it gets really loud, really messy, and really bloody. Last man standing, pretty much. The crowd, of course, watches and places bets, which is always insane to me. I can't watch UFC sometimes. I don't like seeing things break, let alone a Helena duel. Catch me inside sipping milk, texting my ex. Hard pass, freaks. Number 2, train games. Entertainment was always a hit or miss when it comes to these historical lists. The Romans held gladiator battles with animals that drew in thousands of spectators from across the land. Well, in 1894, William Crush, a railwayman, had this event in mind that would for sure go down in history. Oh buddy, did it ever. William Crush wanted to secure the future of the railroad company in Missouri, Kansas, and Texas. And to do so, William made an entire temporary city appropriately named the city of Crush. Nice. There was a carnival for children to enjoy and all that jazz, but the main pull for adults was the train smash. The collision of two 40-ton steam trains was meant to be the talk of the town. Look at these Goliaths as they smash, crush, into each other. How fun. Yeah, the trains collided, it worked, and the darndest thing happened. They blew up. Yeah, it's almost like they caused a disaster for popularity. Neat. 40,000 came in and many left injured. A couple of people sadly didn't leave at all. One survivor ended up getting 10 grand out of the deal. His name was J.C. Dean, and they lost their eye in the explosion, so the company gave them a lifetime railway pass. Just the thing you want right after that horrific event. Sorry about your eye, here's free PTSD as well, anytime you want. Enjoy. Crush was later rehired by the railway after it gained popularity. Yeah, this happened back then too. Somebody does something horrible, and then now all of a sudden they're famous. Hashtag chairgirl. And finally, coming in at number 1, Elmer McCurdy. This one is insane, I had to end with it. Elmer McCurdy, back in 1911, he decided to be a rootin' tootin' criminal, and he attempted to rob a train. Unbeknownst to him, that train was not full of gold, but rather passengers. Collecting a whopping $46, which back then was still pretty good, he was quickly shot by a lawman afterwards. This is where things start to get insane. Yeah, I say start. Elmer's body was embalmed and sold by the Undertaker to this traveling carnival. His body was an exhibit almost, with his story attached. And for the next 60 years, his body, this prop rather, was passed around, sold between haunted houses and wax museums. Eventually the guy's body, his real body, don't forget, ends up in California at an amusement park funhouse at Long Beach. Now, come 1976, there's a crew there filming for the $6 Million Man Show, and that's when Elmer's finger breaks off accidentally. Some key grips like, whoops, revealing it was an actual mummy. They went to film the $6 Million Man and ended up finding the $46 man in real life. How gross is that?
Number 10, Pearl Hart. Pearl Hart was a notorious figure in the American Wild West, known for involvement in a stagecoach robbery. Her life story is often intertwined with the tales of the Old West and the outlaws who sought adventure and fortune during that era. Pearl Hart, whose real name was Pearl Taylor, was born in Canada in 1871, but was later moved to the United States and became involved in various activities, including acting and singing. In 1899, Pearl Hart and a companion, Joe Boot, decided to rob a stagecoach in Arizona. The stagecoach was en route from the Globe to Florence, carrying passengers and valuables. The stagecoach robbery did not go as planned, as Pearl Hart and Joe Boot were not experienced criminals, and their attempt was somewhat amateurish. They failed to obtain a significant amount of loot, and after the failed robbery, Pearl and Joe was captured by law enforcement. They were then later arrested and brought to trial, and Pearl Hart and Joe Boot were tried for their crimes. During the trial, Pearl presented herself as a victim of circumstances, arguing that she had committed the robbery due to personal circumstances. She was convicted and sentenced to only 5 years in prison. As for Joe, nobody knows. Pearl Hart's life after her release from prison remains somewhat of a mystery. After serving about 2 years of her sentence, she was released due to good behavior, and Pearl Hart's belief was dramatic stint as a stagecoach robber contributed to her lasting notoriety as the annals of Wild West history. Her story became a part of a lore surrounding outlaws and characteristics of American frontier. Number 9. Laura Bullion was also known as the Rose of the Wild Bunch. She was a female outlaw associated with the Wild Bunch Gang, a notorious group of American outlaws led by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid during the late 19th and early 20th century. Laura Bullion was born in Knickerbocker, Texas in 1876. Her family moved to the mining town of Moab, Utah, where she grew up. Laura became acquainted with the members of the Wild Bunch, including Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and then other notorious outlaws. She developed a romantic relationship with Kid Curry, a member of the gang, and Laura Bullion participated in various criminal activities with the Wild Bunch, including train and bank robberies. She was also known for her sharpshooting skills and her involvement in the gang's illegal enterprises. In 1901, Laura was arrested in St. Louis, Missouri for her involvement in a train robbery. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison but only served about 3, and after her release from prison, Laura Bullion tried to lead a more law-abiding life. She lived under an assumed name in Memphis, Tennessee, working as a housekeeper. Laura Bullion then passed away on December 2nd, 1961 in Memphis, Tennessee, at the age of 85, and her death was largely unnoticed by the public. Number 8, there is a limited historical information about Belle Sidions, who is also known as Madame Vestal. She was a figure associated with the American Old West during the late 19th century, particularly in the realms of entertainment and the infamous red light districts of frontier towns. Belle Sidions was reportedly an entertainer and an actress who performed in various theatrical productions and shows during the late 1800s. But later in her life, Belle Sidions adopted the alias Madame Vestals and became known for her role as Madame, managing establishments and red light districts. These areas were known for housing brothels and establishments that provided various forms of entertainment. During the late 19th century, the American West would experience rapid growth with numerous people seeking fortune and adventures in newly settled areas, as well as red light districts. The presence of the red light districts, saloons, and entertainment venues catered to the needs of this transient population that was very common. Like many individuals associated with the red light districts of the Old West, the details of Belle Sidion's life remain somewhat elusive and separating the fact that a legend can be challenging. Nevertheless, figures like Madame Vestals contribute to the colorful and diverse tapestry of the Old West societal history. Number 7, Rose Dunn, also known as the Rose of the Cameron, was a legendary figure associated with the American Old West. Born in 1878, Rose Dunn gained notoriety for her romantic entanglements with outlaws and her involvement in the activities of the Wild Bunch gang. Rose Dunn was also born in Indian Territory, which later became Oklahoma in 1878. She came from a large family and her brothers were also known for their involvement in outlaw activities. Rose Dunn then became romantically involved with George Bitter Creek Newcomb, a member of the Wild Bunch gang led by Bill Doolin. The Wild Bunch was notorious for its involvement in train and bank robberies, as we know. In 1895, a shootout occurred in the Dunn family ranch involving lawmen seeking to capture Dunn brothers and their associates. During the confrontation, Rose's brother John Dunn was killed and her older brother George Dunn was captured after the death of Bitter Creek Newcomb. Rose Dunn then lived more of a settled life and she married Charles Albert Noble, a farmer, and they had a family. Rose and Charles lived in Cathridge, Missouri. Rose Dunn then passed away on February 5th, 1955 in Parachute, Colorado. Number 6, Sarah Jane Newman was born in Tennessee in 1817 and later moved to Texas. Also known as Sally Skull, was a figure associated with the Texas frontier during the mid-19th century. Her life story involves elements of violence, crime, and romance, contributing to her notoriety in the history of the American West. Sarah married George Washington Skull, a Texan and a participant in the Texan War of Independence. George Skull operated a ferry and owned a ranch in a location known as Skull Crossing in the San Antonio River. The crossing was an important point for travelers and cattle drives, as the Skull family became involved in violent feuds with the Taylor family over land and cattle. This feud escalated and resulted in several killings on both sides, with also casualties in 1867. During the height of the feud, Sally Skull was widowed after her husband George Skull was killed. Following his death, she sought out revenge and killed several members of the Taylor family. And after the killings, Sally Skull was captured and imprisoned. She was definitely tried for the deaths, but was charged or dropped due to insufficient evidence. And after her release, Sally Skull's life became less eventful as she lived in relatively obscurity and passed away in 1888.